Right, good evening. If you do have a mobile phone, if you'd like to put it on silent, please, thank you. Massive welcome for the first time to David Trimble of the Aetherius Society with the Aetherius Society Contacts with the Gods from Space. David is the organiser of the Northern UK branch of the Aetherius Society. Tonight he will cover the works of Dr. George King, the Society's founder and advanced yoga practitioner, highlight the inhabitants of our planetary neighbours, Mars, Venus and Jupiter, and look at our history and extraterrestrial contact. Please welcome David Trimble.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, and it's fantastic that so many of you have turned out. We didn't know England were going to have their first match when we fixed this date, but no doubt some people are recording it. So welcome and thank you for coming. I'm hoping tonight to tell you a lot about this particular book, Contacts with the Gods from Space, and about the Aetherius Society. And while I can't see much because of the lights, I wonder how many people in the room have come across the Aetherius Society so far. Quite a handful of people. Have any of you been to a talk by the Aetherius Society before? Or just come across this on the net? Right. Just to start off then, we are an international organisation. The headquarters is in London as far as Europe is concerned. And this book that I'm going to be talking about tonight was written by Dr. George King, the founder of our organisation, whose picture you have up there, together with Richard Lawrence, who is the Executive Secretary of the Aetherius Society for Europe, and he's based in London. And we have another headquarters in Los Angeles, and we have groups and branches in many countries, particularly all the continents, particularly Africa, America, Australia or Australasia, New Zealand and so on, and in Europe. Quite a small organisation. I like to think of us very much as a spiritual commando force. We're all doers, and I hope I'll give you some idea of that as we go along. Now, I think the first thing to say is that we are a not-for-profit organisation. So we're not here to convince you of anything. We're here to tell you about a man who I believe is one of the most extraordinary people that we've had on this planet, certainly in the last 100 years. Dr. George King was born in 1919 in Shropshire. His father was a schoolmaster. His mother was a businesswoman and a psychic, and his grandmother, who lived in Yorkshire, was also a psychic and a well-known medium in her part of the country. Interestingly enough, when he was born, his grandmother came along and took one look at him and said to his mother, Mary, "My God," she said, "this child is not of this world." An interesting comment. He was not a terribly well young boy. His father moved to Yorkshire to run a school near Hawes in North Yorkshire, and he was there for a while, and his father then moved to the east coast of Yorkshire to run a school, and George King went to school there in Gisborough Grammar School. He was very good academically, and he was also extremely keen on martial arts, shooting, boxing, quarterstaff using, and those sorts of things. When he was quite young, 10 or 11 years old, his mother got very ill, and he had been brought up broadly in the Orthodox Church. In later years, he became very interested in Quakerism. But when he was, I think it was 10 or 11, his mother was seriously ill, and the doctor didn't think she had much longer to live. And he decided to take matters into his own hand, and he went out into the woods near his house in Yorkshire, and he said he prayed like he'd never prayed in his life before. And a great being of light appeared in front of him and said, "Go home, your mother will be all right." And she later described this to him as a great vision of great being. And of course she survived and went on to live a good long life. We'll cut, I think, and we'll go to the Second World War, 1939-45. He, like his father before him, who was in the First World War, was a conscientious objector. He did not agree with killing, and yet he was a crack shot and good with his fists and other things. But he joined the fire service, the London Fire Service, in the Blitz. He was a section commander, and they would go into the East End of London after a bombing raid and try and pick up the bits, put out the fires. And very often his men would say to him, well, this is flattened, there's not much point doing any more, let's go back and have a cup of tea. And he would say, no, in the house 2 from the end, there are people in the cellar, we must go and bring them out. He had many things to do in the war, which I'm not going to go into tonight. But after the war, he decided, and this was an extraordinary thing in the 1940s and early 50s, he decided to devote himself to yoga. Now, yoga today is pretty well known, but it's very much the hatha yoga, it's very much the exercise yoga. But in those days, you hadn't heard much about it, and he devoted himself to many forms of yoga. And for 10 years, he practiced these 8 hours a day while holding down a job. And he took any job he could in order to perfect these yoga exercises. One of the things you'll read about him, and very often when the press get in touch, they say he was a taxi driver, and yes, he was. He was a very good taxi driver. He was also a racing driver. He used to race Jaguar cars. He worked for an oil company. He did many different jobs, anything to keep the wolf from the door while he was practicing his yoga. And then one afternoon in May 1954, he had a small flat in Maida Vale in London, and he was washing up the dishes, and he was drying them as some men do, rather like a pack of playing cards, one after the other, and putting them round. And suddenly a loud voice in his room, not in his head, but in the room, said, "Prepare yourself, you're to become the voice of interplanetary parliament." He dropped the dishes. He didn't know what it meant. He had no idea what interplanetary parliament was. But at the time, he had a small yoga group, a very small handful of friends, and they were researching into cures for cancer. And they reckoned that they got pretty close to it. However, he asked all his friends what interplanetary parliament was. None of them knew. So he decided the only thing to do was to sit down and meditate about it. So he had a very difficult and nervous and anxious week. And then through the locked door of his apartment, or his flat I should say, walked a yogi from India. Straight through the door, the floorboards creaked, the chair that he sat on gave way, and this yogi gave him some additional yogic practices which enabled him to raise the power of Kundalini. And that brings me on to his abilities as a trance medium, probably the best trance medium the world has known in the last couple of centuries. How many people here, and again I can't really see very well, but how many people understand what samadhi is? The highest yogic state where the chakras of the body, are you familiar with the chakras? You raise the energies up to a high chakra. And this is a goal for gurus all over the world. And once they reach that, they're probably ready to move on to other things. But he was able to do this, and he did it over and over and over again. So when you get into this state of absolute total bliss, of absolute total knowingness, to come out of that and to come back to living with us in the world as it is today and as it was then, how difficult can that be? But when he was in that state, he was able to be contacted by great beings from other planets, and indeed from others on this earth, members of, for instance, the Great White Brotherhood. And a lot of the things I'm going to be mentioning today, like the Great White Brotherhood, that could be a talk for an hour on its own, who these great beings are. But let me just put something into context. The Great White Brotherhood isn't necessarily white or a brotherhood, but that's its name. Some people call it the spiritual hierarchy of Earth. And probably there are more people there of a dark skin than a white skin. Maybe some Chinese, maybe some Indians, maybe all sorts. And of course ladies as well as men, but it is known as the Great White Brotherhood. And they live in retreats around the world. And a very interesting lecture can be given about these. Probably you'll have heard of these people in the Himalayas and the extraordinary feats that they're able to do. And believe it or not, they have moved closer to us in order to help. As I say, that could be a talk for another day. So the other people that came through were from other planets in our solar system. And the interesting thing to me was that when he was contacted, he was told that he needed to spread these messages. And the first messages were given in London, in the Caxton Hall. Now, when I was a boy, I was born in '39, just before the Second World War. But I remember the Caxton Hall was a place where socialites who had already been married went to be married again. And of course it was used as a lecture hall as well. But my introduction to the Society was because I was in London going to a theatre and a hotel weekend, and I'd been working in the city that day. And as I walked back to my hotel in St James's, the St Ermin Hotel, I walked past the Caxton Hall, and outside the Caxton Hall was a notice board which said UFO talk tonight. And instead of going to the theatre with my wife, I went to that, which didn't go down terribly well, as you can imagine. For me, it was fascinating. Richard Lawrence, the co-author of this book, and a colleague of his, John Holder, were giving a talk that night. Richard had just come back from America with the first transcripts under the Freedom of Information Act released by the American government on UFOs. And one of the stories that he told me was of an American fighter plane which had been scrambled to go up and shoot a UFO, which frankly we call a spacecraft, and I can tell you more about those as we go along. So it was sent up. The moment the pilot put his finger on the button to fire, all his instrumentation panel went out. And as he did so, he was told to go in again, so he did a circuit. And out of this UFO came a smaller craft, circled the aircraft and went back into the aircraft. He went back into the attack mode, finger on the button, and once again, before he could press it, all his instrumentation panel ran out, and he had to go back to base to refuel. So that is, I think, a perfect example of the non-belligerence. It's rather like a great big strong man with a little boy hacking at his shins, and the strong man saying, no, don't do that, sonny, just take your time.